What I want to do, guys, is since it's quite an intimate group, I would like to open it up for direct questions and answers so that we can engage with one another right away. I think that way we can get the most out of this session. We don't have that much time together. So let's open it up for questions and answers straight away, inshallah. Who has the first question? Yes, we have a question. Salam.
My name is Imai. My question to you is, what should we do when we feel low sometimes in our iman? Like, हमारा ईमान हमेशा high नहीं होता, we feel low sometimes. So what should we do?
Okay, Jazakumullah khairan. The question was, what do we do when we feel quite low and we have like low iman and we feel low? I mean, look, there are a few things in psychology which correlate to the feeling of being low. So one of them is depression, okay? One of them is something called transitory sadness. And the third one is grief. These are three diagnoses usually that are given to people who feel low, and they're all different from one another. So typically, psychologists would differentiate between what is referred to as transitory sadness and depression, in so much as transitory sadness is usually put on by some extraneous variable. Something happened to someone in their life, they become sad. And that's a very natural thing to happen to human beings. In fact, that's what should happen to human beings. The difference usually that's made between transitory sadness and depression is that transitory sadness goes for up to 6 months and depression's more than 6 months. And usually depression is not as a result of some extraneous variable. Grief is a different animal altogether. Grief is a different thing. Bereavement or grief usually has stages. They're referred to as the 6 stages of grief, well known in the literature, etc. Now, what does Islam say about all of this? Now, Islam doesn't negate that a human being, a Muslim, can feel any of those things. In fact, you had people who are prophets who felt that. Like, for example, in the Quran, Yaqub alayhi salam in Surah Yusuf, he says, إِنَّمَا أَشْكِي بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. That I certainly complain my bereavement and my grief to Allah, which means he felt grief himself. In the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know that he had Aam al-Huzn, which is the year of grief, when his wife died, Khadija radiallahu anha, and when his uncle died, Abu Talib. So grief is actually no way of manipulating that. And it's not an indication that you are a bad person or have low iman or have low faith if you're feeling grief. Because if this was the case, then surely the prophets would not have felt that feeling. Obviously, Maryam alayhi salam in the Quran, she was so bereaved. She said, "Ya laytani mittu qabla hadha wa kuntu nasyan mansiya," that I wish I had died before this and I was completely forgotten. Which means that she had reached such a pinnacle of grief and she had been grief-stricken to the point where she didn't say, "I want to die, kill myself," but she said, "I wish I wasn't here," which shows you that it's a natural emotion. As for al-iktiab, usually this is the Arabic translation for depression. You won't find this in the Quran and Sunnah per se, but you do find the term sadness in the Quran and Sunnah. And one of the famous hadiths of that is there's a hadith in Bukhari which says that there will be somebody who is ashqa ahl al-jannah, or ashqa ahl al-jannah, which effectively means the saddest person in the dunya, okay, that will go to heaven. And then the hadith continues that he was yughmasu fil jannah. He's going to be dipped into Jannah and he's going to say, "I've never felt any sadness at all." The point being is that sadness, which is due to some kind of extraneous variable, is something which, yes, which Islam accepts human beings can go through. And it's not an indication that someone who goes through that has low iman or should be scolded for that or should be reprimanded for that or anything like that. There is a problem though, which is what? Which is if someone becomes hopeless. Now, depression itself, psychologically, if you look at depression, it has a spectrum, it has a range. At the end of it is what you call hopelessness, which is usually accompanied sometimes by what is referred to as suicide ideation. Someone even thinks about killing themselves. Now, there is a kind of depression which is unacceptable in Islam. And that is the kind of depression which is unacceptable in Islam. And the evidence for that is in the same surah, which we first mentioned. Allah says in the Quran, He says, وَمَا يَيْأَسُ مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. That no one is hopeless from the mercy of God except for disbelieving people. So hopelessness indicates that you don't have trust in God, a complete hopelessness. So depression cannot spill over to a kind of hopelessness in God. There has to be tawakkul and reliance to that level. So yes, Islam it doesn't live this utopian life of a psychological kind that says you can't be depressed and you can't be sad and you can't grieve. But it says you can't be hopeless. And you can't let depression take you to a certain level where you're contemplating killing yourself or contemplating these things, because that's within your willpower to avoid. And Allah says in the Quran, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها, that Allah does not burden a soul with more than it can handle. Another verse, لا تكلف نفس إلا وسعها, that the soul is not given more than it can handle. So this is the Islamic understanding of it. Now, one more thing. I did have a discussion. Whoever was introducing me mentioned it with Jordan Peterson. Now he is, for all intents and purposes, we know his stance now on the Palestine issue, and we don't respect him for that. However, there was a few things which were interesting because he's a clinical psychologist at the end of the day. And I did discuss with him something which I found, which is very interesting. It's a study which I came across. It's called, and you can research this on Google on your own time, and as a point of research. It's called the effect of oneness on the effect of oneness on life satisfaction. And the person who done this study is someone called Laura Marie, and it was done in Germany by 3 or 4 different people. And this study showed that, it's very interesting, it showed that if you believe in one monotheistic beliefs, like oneness beliefs, like Tawheed effectively, that increases your life satisfaction. And what the study concluded was that the group of people that had the greatest life satisfaction from all other groups were Muslims. And followed by Christians, followed by Hindus, etc., etc. So they actually surveyed that. It's a very interesting thing. Now we already knew there was a Pew Research study that was done in 2019 that religious people, generally speaking, have better life satisfaction than atheists. That's something in 2019 Pew Research has discovered. But this is the first study that I come to see, which I think was in 2020, 1 year afterwards, which specified Muslims and indicated that the reason why they had this was because of oneness beliefs. And the Quran mentions that. It says, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, that certainly, by the remembrance of God do hearts find rest. And on the flip side, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا وَنَحْشُرُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أَعْمَى. Whoever swerves away from my remembrance, he will have a depressed life. Like his entire life will be depressed. Now once again, so with Peterson I had this discussion, and he was saying, I know his interpretation is because when you believe in one thing, like one God, and your focus is on one God, submitting to one God, Tawheed and whatever, then your focus is not multiplicitous. Because when you have multiple focuses, what that does is it creates anxiety. If you have too many things to think about. But when you have one overarching thing, it allows you to focus. And what better overarching thing could you have in your life than the transcendental principle which is the creator of the heavens and the earth, which is the one God. There's nothing better that you can imagine that can create a uniform and anchored effect for the human psychology than believing and worshipping one God. So, in sum, I would say, in terms of how to increase your iman and how to remove, it's true that there are ways, spiritually speaking, that you can actually become less depressed. This is something which you're not going to see in a psychological manual, because if you go to a psychiatrist, they'll say, look, take an SSRI, there are these drugs. They're called SSRIs, and they effectively manipulate one of your neurotransmitters like dopamine or serotonin or something like that. That's what they'll tell you to do. Or they'll tell you to do something like CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. But what Islam tells you to do is to focus on your mission, which is to worship God. Allah says in the Quran, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ خُلِقَ هَلُوعًا إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ مَنُوعًا إِلَّا الْمُصَلِّينَ. That certainly the human being has been created in a state of anxiety and panic. Can you imagine Allah saying this to us? That certainly the human being is created in a state of panic, that when evil befalls him, something happens calamitous in that person's life, some trauma happens, that they become in a panic state. And when good happens, they become very, if you like, stingy with it. And except for, and there's an entire maybe 10 verses dedicated to the exception, the ones who pray and they are consistent on the prayer, and the ones who do this, because the spiritual activity, it creates that strength and it moves you away from that anxiety. So yes, from the Islamic perspective, there's no doubt that Islam proposes that the more you are connected to Allah, the more you worship Him, the more you are away from the sins, the more solid you will be, and the less anxiety that you will have in your life. Hopefully that answers the question. Let's see who else has another question. Don't be shy, guys, you know.
So we've got a question from the audience,
Yep.
which asks, how can we identify the actual Islamic people? How can we identify who's actually guiding Muslims to real Islam? What is the criteria to identify an actual and authentic guided person?
So it's a good question. What's the criterion of finding out who to... You know, Imam al-Shafi'i said something very powerful. He said that if you want to know who to follow, see where the arrows of the enemies are pointing. See where the arrows of the enemies are pointing. And recently, you know, the Israeli army had my name on one of the missiles. I put this on Twitter. I said, look, this is good proof. Only kidding. But the point is usually if someone has an agenda, okay, which is clearly connected with an anti-Islam agenda, they're a write-off. That person's a write-off. And that is a very important thing. The second thing is their general piety. Their general piety, which disqualifies me altogether now. But no, when I look for someone to take knowledge from, I look at two or three things. Like Islamic knowledge, and I spoke about, like, for example, fatwas and ijtihad. And I look at their piety, how they live Islam, because the last thing you want is a hypocrite. For me, one of the most important things is that the person has to be courageous. Because if they're not courageous, when something difficult happens, they will succumb and capitulate under pressure. They have to be extremely knowledgeable. So for me, I have to see that they actually possess knowledge. I literally, just yesterday, was speaking to one of your great scholars. His name is Mufti Taqi Uthmani. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. And he, like, for example, when I was speaking to him, you could see the man had great piety. The man had great students. He was living what he's practicing what he preached. Things like that is what you'd be looking for. Someone who's not gaining directly or benefiting or manipulating. So there are lots of scholars that you could take from. And the way you'd think about it is, think about it as if you had a medical issue, sometimes you need a second opinion. You don't always need to go to just one scholar. You might go to a second and a third and see what they all say, and then see what the majority, for example, say. Or see if position A makes more sense than position B. So you have to employ a certain level of criticality as well. You can't just blindly follow one person all your life. But in terms of the things I'd be looking for, especially when it comes to Islam, it is things like, for example, that, you know, valiant nature, the courageous nature, the gallant nature. I'd also be looking at the piety, I'd be looking at the knowledge, and the area of specialism. Because someone might be very good at one area, but not good at another area. Someone might be fantastic at hadith, but not good at fiqh, for example. So these are the kinds of things I'll be looking at. Next question.
We've got a question regarding dua. Why can we make dua in our bad time? It is not answered. It weakens our iman. What should we do?
So the question is, why when we make dua, is it not answered? Now there is a hadith which says that dua can either be answered directly, or it can be postponed. It can be postponed, or it can be made into something in the hereafter for you. Now, the person who has the mentality that my dua is not being answered is usually the person whose dua will not be answered. Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, أَنَا عِنْدَ حُسْنَ ظَنَّ عَبْدِي بِي. I am as my servant thinks of me. So if my servant thinks negatively of me, then he will be given a negative outcome. One of the Ibn al-Qayyim mentions, for example, one of his books, that he mentions 6 points of dua, when to do the dua, the adab and the etiquettes of dua, etc. One of the points that he mentions is al-ilhahu fi dua, which is effectively persistence in dua. And it might be the case if someone says, oh, why is my dua not being accepted? It could be the case that your money is coming from a haram place. It could be that you're falling into a kind of sin. It could be that you're doing something which Allah doesn't like. And there's a famous hadith on this. You know, مَأْكَلُهُ حَرَامُ وَمَلْبَسُهُ حَرَامُ. You know, فَأَنَّ يُسْتَجَابَ لَهُ. How is it that this person thinks that their dua will be answered? Like, for example, somebody who's making dua, but he doesn't pray 5 times, or she doesn't pray 5 times a day. Or someone who's making dua, but then they are involved in being negative to both of their parents. Your mother and your father, for example. You have a bad relationship with your mother and your father. Maybe that's the reason why your dua is not being answered. So you have to, when it comes to dua, you have to make sure that you expunge yourself from the sins that could potentially block one's dua from being answered. Plus, you have to have the mentality that your dua will be answered, and inshallah it will be answered.
Our next question is about falling into sin again and again. What do we do when we fall into the same sin over and over again, despite trying so hard to not to do it, and now the person is feeling hopeless?
Well, I mean, look, there's no need to feel hopeless about it. This is effectively addiction. And people have different kinds of addiction because we are living in the age of addiction. You know, we are living in the age of addiction. There's addiction everywhere. You go on your phone, there's, sorry to say, pornography that people are addicted to. Some people are addicted to pornography because it's so easy to access. It's extremely easy. And if it's not pornography, then it might be something similar to it, like a softer version of it. And if it's not that, it could be, for example, that someone's addicted to a kind of drug. I don't know to what extent this is a problem here in Pakistan, but there are different drugs that people are addicted to. Or people could be addicted to certain behaviors which are negative. They have negative habits. And really, what you need to do when it comes to addictions is you need to, first of all, sit with yourself and not deny the fact that you have an addiction problem. Because some people are addicted, but they don't identify it as an addiction. So number one, you have to say to yourself, okay, let me be honest, I'm addicted to vapes or, I don't know, cigarettes or, pornography. That's the first thing you're going to sit down and admit to yourself, that, okay, I'm addicted, I'm an addict. So then the second thing is what to do about that. The second thing to do about that is, number one, you have to develop a strong will to remove that. So you must want to remove that. Some philosophers refer to this as second order volition. So you have to want to remove that. So you think to yourself, okay, what are the benefits of me removing this thing, addiction X, from my life? The benefits are that I have stronger willpower, for example. And that's, by the way, if this was the only benefit of eliminating an addiction, it would be enough of a benefit. Because if you're addicted to something, whatever that thing may be, that calls into question your resilience as a human being. It calls into question the extent to which you can withhold issues and you can fight off the urge. There are 2 things effectively that if you can control, you're likely to be successful. 2 things. One of them is your fear and the other one is your desires. If you can control these 2 things in your life, you're likely to be a very successful person. Because if you can control your fear and anxiety, you'll become courageous. That's what that means. Being courageous means taking risks which are calculated, but which mean that you have to, despite feeling fear, act in a certain manner. The other one is desire. So it could be sexual desire, it could be anger. And both of those things are linked. So for example, in psychoanalytic theory, someone like Freud, etc., they would refer to it in a compound way. They would say there's sexual aggressive urges. So if you could control your anger and your sexual desires, and you can control your fear, there's really nothing stopping you from doing anything you want to do in life. Because you can start becoming extremely disciplined person, resilient person, powerful person. But if those two things are control of you, then you will be unspectacular and unremarkable in this world. You will be forgotten in history. This is the truth. If you look at any successful person, okay, and put success in quotation marks, in any field that you like, whether it's educational field, whether it's an athlete, a sports field, or whatever else, they've had to be able to control those two things, at least to some extent. Now, controlling it doesn't mean denying it. Now, I'm not saying to you that become celibate or become reckless. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying that part of controlling those desires is knowing how to manage it. So going back to the addictions problem, if one is addicted to certain behaviors or certain things, then one must cut the issue from the root. One must realize their own limitations. Let me tell you something which might sound controversial. Under certain circumstances, anyone can do anything. When I say anything, obviously within logical parameters. What I mean by that is, it's possible for anyone in this room to commit zina. Now, I'm not saying that me or you or anybody else would do that. Alhamdulillah, most of us are good Muslims and all that. But in certain circumstances, if you must know that it's like a Hoover effect, you know the Hoover, or a magnet effect. There's certain things, if you come close to it, it will suck you in. It's like quicksand. So you can't come close to that thing. Everyone in this room is capable of maybe harming someone physically, and maybe many of us killing someone. Now, I'm not saying that, once again, I'm not saying that you or I would do that, but we're all capable of it. You must understand that the human being is capable of great evil. And what story showed us this reality best? The story of Joseph. And you know what's powerful is when Joseph was seduced by the woman, he said, the Quran says, you know, وَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا, that she was desirous for him and he was desirous for her. Everything was in place. Except that he saw Burhan Rabbi, the Burhan of Allah. So it was Allah, he attributed the fact that he was saved from that situation to Allah. So the point is, what I'm saying to you is, we need to realize when it comes to addictions and bad behaviors and bad actions, all of us are capable. None of us are absolved. And that's what Yusuf said. He says, إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ وَلَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي. He said, I don't absolve myself, that certainly the self is instilled with it great evil. So we all have that capability. Allah says in the Quran, فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, that وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا, Allah created the self. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, He gave it its capability of doing bad things and good things. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. The one who has purified it is already successful, and the one who has corrupted it is already a failure. So the point I'm making to you is that in terms of sinning and sinning, keep sinning, because that was the question that was asked. How do you avoid that? You have to, number one, you have to acknowledge that you're an addict. That is the first thing. Don't deny it anymore, okay? You have to sit with yourself and say, okay, I'm repeating this behavior. So then you say to yourself, khalas, I am a pornography addict. Hopefully no one's going to take this and snip it up. This one piece of the video, I am a pornography addict. No, but that's what it is. Or I am a, I don't know, such and such opium addict, or I am a, could be vape addict, or whatever it could be. Cigarette addict, or addict to whatever it may. Once you've identified that's what you are, okay, then the second stage is, okay, what am I going to do about it? So the answer is, I have to want to get rid of this behavior. In other words, I have to have motivation to remove it before I remove it. You can't just remove it like that. You have to have motivation to remove it. After you've got motivation to remove it, the third step is, then you have to know if you go into this area, these boundaries, that you're likely to fail. So for example, in the case of pornography addiction, you might know for a fact that if you're alone in this area, in these conditions, the likelihood is 60%, 70% you're going to go on something haram. The likelihood is 80% maybe for someone, 90%. And if you go in this environment with this man or this woman in this particular environment, then the likelihood that something bad will happen between you is 60, 70, 80%. So when you know that for a fact based on past experiences, why would you put yourself in a position like that? So you have to start being honest with yourself. Okay, the likelihoods and percentage basis that I'm going to fall into X, Y, Z sin if this condition is met is 70%, which means I have to remove the thing which leads to this behavior, which is why Allah says in the Quran, وَلَا تَقَرَبُوا الزِّنَا. He didn't say don't, وَلَا تَزْنُوا. He didn't say don't do zina. He said don't come near it. Because it's a slippery slope. It is a slippery slope. So you've got to be careful about that. These are the three stages that in terms of sins, in terms of addictions, in terms of anything you like, if you follow them, you will be successful. Inshallah. Let's go for the next question. Yes, sir. Salam.
My question to you is there any way today to unite the Muslim Ummah? As you see that Muslim Ummah is divided in different sects and different matters, like the matter of Ishura for humanity. So is there any way today to unite the Ummah?
So the question he asked was that, is there any way to unite the Muslim Ummah? And there's almost 2 billion of us, I think 2 billion Muslims now. And the more you have of people, it's difficult, the more difficult it is to unite them. Now, the truth of the matter is, we need to detail exactly what it is that we think is a desirable outcome. There is a difference between unity and uniformity. Okay? Uniformity is that everyone can, all the Muslims come, and we all must believe in the same thing. Now, I'll be honest with you, if that's what we're looking for, we're not going to find that. That's impossible. I would say that is, the likelihood of that happening is 1%, 0%. However, unity is, we think of one issue, for example, the Palestine issue, okay? Or, for example, India and Kashmir, for example. Or, for example, the Rohingya, in Burma, or whatever issue it may be, and we say we're going to all work together on this issue. Now, these are ways in which you can unify the Ummah, through issues. Another one is through political leadership. Now, that's something which requires all the nation states, 59 of them which are Muslim effectively, to realize that it's in their best interest to come together. And in my opinion, the best way to do that is not through religion. Because if you try and tell these people, look, taqillah, right now they're not going to do it. But it can be done through a shrewd political method. Someone comes and says, look, form an economic bloc, you'll get some benefits out of it. Like what the Europeans done, the European Union, for example. Why can't we have the Islamic Union? I think if we had the Islamic Union, right, and we do have like councils and stuff, but I'm saying a proper union where you can transfer populations and things can be, even maybe, not going to say unified currency, but we can think about these things and see what makes sense and what doesn't. If we had something like that, that's one step away from what we want. But it took them a world war to realize that that was good for them. What the West is actually quite good at now is bringing people of different opinions together and having a civil society. We need to do that for the Muslim world, because the moment we do that for the Muslim world, our standards of living, our standards of dying, our standards of procreating, everything's going to go up. We're going to succeed in dunya and deen. So the way to do that, I think, really, on a political level, is that there needs to be someone that shows these Muslim leaders that there's a benefit, an economic benefit in that. I'll be honest, that's what I think has to happen. If you ask me, from a political perspective, how are we going to do it practically? Of course, there will be the religious incentivization as well, right? But I'm saying that is one of the things that I think if we did it, we had some kind of a union, even a military union. They got NATO, they got the EU, they got all these kinds of organizations. We could do the same kind of thing. In fact, look, if 5 countries, we've got 59 odd Muslim majority countries, if 5 of them came together, we would have something which competes with the West immediately. If you think about it. If Pakistan came together with Turkey and Egypt and Indonesia and I don't know, Nigeria or something like that, that's 5 big countries. We're talking about what, like 800 million people or something, or 700 million people with big armies and strong infrastructure and stuff like that. You know, they have to see the military, the strategic, the geopolitical and the economic effects, benefits of it. And if I think someone can sell this to them, I do believe that. Because that's one step away from, okay, let's just have one leader in the whole thing, in the whole block. And you know what that means. So the point is there's a practical way of doing it. And I don't think it's inconceivable. In the years 1963, I think it was, yes, maybe 1963, 1964, when the Israelis were attacking, Syria and Jordan and Lebanon and these countries, there were 3 countries that actually came together and made one country. I don't know if you know this, but it was Yemen, Egypt, and Syria. They made one country, and they put Gamal Abdel Nasser as the president of that one country. Now, it was a failure. I mean, in many ways, it was a failure. But it just shows you that this can happen. It's not like without precedent. You can get countries together and then have one single president. If you get 4 or 5 big countries together and then, So I think there's a way of doing it politically, but you have to sell it. Someone has to be, like, if you look at how Germany came together, because Germany was not one country, it was different states and stuff, right? And someone like von Bismarck, who's a huge figure, he put them all together. He put all the states together. This has happened many times in history, in Muslim and non-Muslim history. I think that is very possible to happen again. But we just need to be able to sell it to the Muslim governments. And I think we can.
I actually have 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first question is, what are your thoughts on the culture of Islamization these days, where you wrap every Islamic thing with the wrapping paper of Islam and then present it to the Muslim majority, like Islamic democracy, Islamic banking, Islamic, like how feminism is part of Islam. So that's the first question. And the second question is, what are your thoughts on Abdul Wahid's debate with Piers Morgan and the ban on Hizb ut-Tahrir that followed in UK?
So what was the first question again, sorry?
What are your thoughts on the culture of Islamization these days, where, so you take things from outside the religion and then you wrap them with the wrapping paper of Islam and then...
Oh, okay, that's what you mean by that. Okay. Well, I mean, look, these are complicated issues because it's not all like, for example, you mentioned Islamic finance. That was one of the things I mentioned. I had this whole long conversation with your Grand Mufti, Sheikh Mufti Taqi Uthmani. That's his field. I mean, I don't know how old he is now, 80 years old. And I asked him about that because I had the same question as you. And it's more complicated. Like I told him a few models and stuff, and he said, this one's got this problem, and this one's got this problem, and this one, if you tweak it in this way, it can become Sharia compliant, and if you do this. So it's not black and white, I have to say. And I'm not really in a position to say, okay, this one's the right one, and this one's the wrong one, and this one's the good one, or whatever it is. There's a difference of opinion among the scholars of the different Islamic finance products out there. That's the honest truth of the matter. Some people have a very staunch stance, which is anti, and they say you might as well just get a mortgage from the normal retail bank, for example. I don't really know if I agree with that, because it's, as Sheikh Mufti Taqi Uthmani, he said that one is very clear, the other ones are not as clear. So that's number one. It's not just Islamic finance, it's like you said, there's different things, and each of them have their own analyses. As for the banning of Hizb ut-Tahrir, I was called in to speak about that with Piers Morgan. He called me a few times. I mean, it's not really a subject that I wanted to speak to them about. However, I'll be honest with you, I think the labeling of terrorist organizations in the West is a joke, and it's done for pragmatic reasons. And I tried to bring that to the table when I was speaking to Piers Morgan, especially in the second debate, because what is the criterion by which and through which these Western governments decide who is a terrorist organization? Is it hate speech? Is it call for violence? What is it exactly? Because if it is all those things, then we have to ask ourselves, is Hizb ut-Tahrir falling into that? Because I've not seen that from them, frankly. I've not seen them talk about violence and all these kind of things in the way in which, say, for example, the IDF is doing, and clearly genociding the Palestinian people. So I think it's just convenience for the Western people. They're doing what works for them geopolitically and strategically. We know their game now. Their masks have completely dropped. And frankly, this is a great lesson for us as Muslim people. And there's a verse in the Quran which kind of epitomizes all of that in half a sentence, which is "Ha antum ulai tuhibbunahum wa la yuhibbunakum." That you, O Muslims, you love them and they don't love you. For all this time, we've had an asymmetrical relationship with the West. That's what we've had. There's many people in this country, we talk about the Islamization of certain things, but let's really talk about the feminization and the liberalization and the secularization. Because that's happening here in Pakistan, for example, right? We see there's pockets of secular and liberal feminist communities. The kind of feminism we're talking about, the kind of liberalism, is a Western knowledge production. Like the salt and the flavor of it comes from the West. So the point is, what the Palestine thing has shown us is that, frankly, feminists of the West don't care about women of the rest. When was the last time, what have, for example, feminists of the West done for the women in Kashmir? That's my question. I want to know what campaign has been done by feminists of the West about the women in Kashmir here who have been brutally destroyed and raped and pillaged, if it's meant to be an international movement, right? If feminism is meant to help women everywhere, what about the 15,000 women that were slaughtered and their kids were slaughtered in Palestine recently? What campaign, what global campaign have we seen from feminists in the West, for example, on that? If you really do an analysis on the kind of talking points you see from these kinds of people, feminists in the West and liberals in the West, you'll see that the talking points relate to their own self-interest. Where it's talking about abortion and equal rights, equal pay, I should say, in England. But that's not an international movement. And so when I say the Palestine thing has allowed the mask to drop, people in this country and other parts of the Muslim world should see they don't really care about you. And it goes back to the verse in the Quran. You love them, you watch their Netflix shows, you watch their movies, you have a relationship and a connection with them, but believe me, if they saw your own children being killed, they wouldn't care. A lot of them wouldn't care. Not all of them, of course. I'm not generalizing, but a lot of them wouldn't care. They wouldn't care as much as they care about their own projects and equal pay and abortion and all these things they talk about in the West. So feminism, Western feminism, has focused effectively on the conveniences of the white woman in the West. That's what it's focused on. And then when the second and third wave came, a bit of the black movement and black feminism came into it. But it's black feminism in America. They don't care about Nigerian women as much. Although there was that woman in Ngozi who she was dual national, she was Nigerian, and she wrote a book called The Feminist Manifesto. But she noticed herself that, okay, actually these other feminists are not the same as me because I'm coming with a different perspective. What I'm saying to you is, you cannot be sold a lie. And the masks have dropped. And you don't want an asymmetrical relationship and to be intellectually colonized by a people who genuinely, for the most part, do not care that much. They do not care that much of the butchering of the I went to Bangladesh, maybe I think it was 6-7 years ago, and I went to a place called Cox's Bazar. And I met Rohingya women, and this is online and stuff, and I spoke to them, and their experiences were completely underreported in the Western media. I was shocked. The stuff that I was hearing from them was shocking, that they were sexually abused, that one of them said that they saw their child being thrown into a fire, and that they had to live, and she was crying, and these kind of things. And we had 2 translators. One translator from their language to Bengali and Bengali into English. And they were telling us all these stories. And so, with all due respect, we, as the Muslim people, we need to realize that the ones who care about us the most is us. This is what this should have showed you, this whole situation with Palestine and the Kashmir situation, the Rohingya situation. All those situations show us that the West doesn't care too much about, even the people, the populace does not care too much about what's happening here. It doesn't. So we need to care about ourselves. And we've gotten the greatest izzah from the pure product of Islam. We know that. Historically, objectively, we've never had more prosperity, militarily, economically, politically, or otherwise, than through Islam. Every other model has not worked here. Democracy hasn't worked in Pakistan, as you saw. Sorry to say. Hasn't worked. So what I'm saying to you is, we need to start thinking about our own models and our own futures. And don't be fooled by the West. I've been living there all my life. You know, they are, many of the people there, and it's not all of them, but many of the people there, especially the elites, they don't even care about the ethnic minorities. I mean, look what happened with the black community in America. Look how they're treated, for example. So, yeah, I mean, I think we need to start thinking about our own projects, inshallah. Yes.
I have one question.
Yeah.
My question is, what's your view about, what's your advice to Muslims? Because Islam's complete submission to the order and command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But nowadays Muslims are very picky in the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Especially, what's your advice to the Islamic feminism? Because I believe Islamic feminism is more worse than actual feminism. And the actual issue which I feel among women of Pakistan especially is Islamic feminism. Like, they really don't want to listen that Islam allows polygamy, which is the main issue in the humans, in the women especially. Whenever Islamic speaker talk about the polygamy in Pakistan, they have raised a lot of bashing on that speaker, like how dare he talk about this problem. So I really want your advice.
She was talking about Islamic feminism, and she said, what's the advice? I wrote a small book, okay? It's called Fifth Wave Feminism, okay? And we all know that feminism went through waves. First wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism, and some say fourth. So I made a book called Fifth Wave, okay? Because, anyway, the point of the book was this. On the third and fourth waves, if you want to even call that a fourth wave, one of the main themes of the feminist project was actually something called intersectionality, okay? Intersectionality. So let me explain what's going on. Second wave feminism focused on these issues that we've spoken about before, things like abortion, things like equal pay, and these kinds of things, right? Third wave feminism is where you'll find, for example, the transgender movement, yeah? So it's someone like Judith Butler who will say something to the effect of, woman is not made, she's basically, the woman is a social construct, not just a gender, but even sex is a social construct. You'll find these kinds of radical ideas there, right? In her book, Gender Troubles, she'll say stuff like that. So the transgender movement, or third wave feminism, and second wave feminism themselves, they're in a dispute. Because second wave feminists, for example, they maintain this idea that there's a patriarchy, that there's men exploiting women and all these kind of things. Third wave feminists are not speaking in those terms, in these what they would call binary terms. Why? Because for them, gender is fluid. Gender is fluid. So we can't speak of a male patriarchy because males are not, we don't know if they're all males in the first place. I mean, we'd have to go and check their pronouns, we'd have to see, because gender is a fluid concept. So patriarchy has to be fluid as well, the way you think about it. Now, there is this, for example, I watched this interesting debate between one of the spearheading founding mothers of second wave feminism called Germaine Greer, who wrote many of her books herself, with these transgenders, and she was taking an anti-view, actually. The point I'm making to you is this. Islamic feminism, what is it exactly? I mean, if we say, okay, I want to understand, what is it exactly? Is it a proposition that you're a Muslim and a feminist at the same time? Okay, so what part of Islam and what part of feminism, and what exactly are we talking about? Are we saying, for example, that you are someone who believes in women's rights and you're a Muslim? Well, I believe in women's rights and I'm a Muslim. But I believe that women's rights and men's rights and animals' rights and everyone is found through Islam rather than despite it. You know, the verse in the Quran, there's one important verse in the Quran that says, أَمْ شَرَعُوا لَهُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ أَمْ لَهُمْ شُرَكَاء شَرَعُوا لَهُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهُ. Do they have shuraka? Do they have partners with God who have legislated to them something from the religion and they don't have permission from Allah. What I'm saying is that Islam tells you what right and wrong is. It has the monopoly. We believe as Muslims that Allah tells us what right and wrong. It has the monopoly on morality, objective morality. So why do I need anything else? Liberalism, feminism, or Marxism? Why do I need a knowledge production that has come from the West, from the white woman? Why do I need to mix that with something I already believe is to be true? Do you see the point? You say, well, it doesn't have to be the white woman. We have Pakistani feminism, for example. Say, okay, what is that? Explain to me philosophically, where does that stand? What are the books of Pakistani feminism that I can read, or Malaysian feminism, which starts from the bottom up? Meaning, for example, Simone de Beauvoir, she was an existentialist. Judith Butler, she's a postmodernist. They start from a philosophical beginning. I don't know of any knowledge production in the Eastern world that has that kind of philosophical bottom-up approach. It doesn't exist. All Pakistani feminists or Arab feminists or Malaysian feminists, or what they're doing effectively is copy and pasting from the white woman. That's what I see. I've not seen anything different, with all due respect. Just issue-based stuff. This here, abortion, this and that. Okay, fine. We can all speak about abortion. We can speak about this and that. Me as a Muslim, I can speak about abortion from an Islamic perspective. Why do I need to go outside of Islam to speak about abortion? I mean, Islam has very detailed laws about abortion, for example, or equal pay. We can talk about that from an Islamic perspective. You might be surprised that we might agree more than you think, for example. But why do I need to add a label to my identity to refer to myself as a feminist, for example? Okay, let me ask another question. Why is, because feminism, fem is talking about the woman, right? Okay, or the female, to be more specific. Why should that be the primary analysis? For example, why are women more important than children, for example, or religion, or tribe, or race? Now, this is the question that the intersectionalists actually faced. The third wave feminists, they said, look, Kimberly Crenshaw, she said, look, there's all these overlapping and intersectional things that come together, and we can't say for a fact that being a woman is the most important thing. It could be being this, being that, being the other. So I'm saying to you, for us, surely being a Muslim is the most important thing, because that one is going to define your afterlife situation. Nothing else from your identity markers are going to do that. Nothing else is going to define what happens to you in the hereafter. So what I'm saying is that if you want to believe in women's rights, you don't have to be a feminist. You don't have to believe in a colonial knowledge production that has come from the West and its extensions. You don't need to do that. You can still believe in women's rights. You can believe in children's rights. You can believe in animal rights. You can believe in everybody's rights without being a feminist. You don't need the white woman to tell you how to live your life. Why do you need that? The British were already here, and then they left. Their boots left this land, but their ideas stayed here. Why do you need to voluntarily put yourself under the boot, the intellectual boot of a white woman? Why do you need to do that? If you truly believe, okay, this is, from my perspective, I'm a Muslim, so I believe that this Muhammad ﷺ was a true prophet. I believe Allah exists. I can argue all of these things. Someone says, what's the proof? I can say, this is the proof, 1, 2, 3. So if I believe in that, I don't need anything else outside of that in order to inform my ideology or how I live my life. So to answer your question, when it comes to Islamic feminism or Islamic liberalism or anything else, one has to ascertain what the person even means by that. If they mean women's rights, that's not a problem at all. No issues. We should all believe in women's rights. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra." Be good to women. Effectively, that's it. In his final speech, he mentioned two things. He mentioned gender and race. In his final speech that he gave in front of so many people, he mentioned gender. He said, "Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra," and he said, "La fadla." He says, no virtue of a black man over a white man or a white man over a black man. He told us this a very long time ago. Now, how we go about doing that is through Islam. Why do we need the prescriptions for me, I have not got a good answer from any secular liberal feminist that lives in the East as to why we need to rely on a knowledge production that is a Western specific knowledge production, for the most part. We don't need that. And it's a kind of inferiority complex. They call it here the Gora complex. Especially when some of these people in these countries, like the Arab feminists or the Arab liberal, when they act in an arrogant manner, say, well, you're a backward person, you're this and that, why don't you do this and do that and the other? Excuse me? I mean, why do you have the audacity to question my morality based on a white man's morality that you have swallowed up? وَأُشْرِبَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمُ الْعِجْلَ بِكُفْرِهِمْ. It's like the golden calf for you. You've swallowed up an ideology and you come and try and talk to me about it as if I have to follow the West. I don't have to follow the West. And I guarantee you, if you go to any in Pakistan, do this experiment. Just trust me on this, yes? You go to any liberal, feminist, whatever, they identify like that. Say to them, name me 5 arguments for the veracity, the philosophical veracity of feminism. Why feminism is true. 5 arguments. In fact, forget 5, 3. Okay, I'm going to go down. 1 argument. I promise you, they will not be able to answer this question. If I were to ask, what is the philosophical, rational justification for why feminism is true as an objective morality? There is no answer to this question. There is no, because it's not true. If you do the same thing with liberalism, they won't be able to answer the question. قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Could bring your evidences if you're truthful. If you're saying this is the truth, then you should bring your evidence for it. So that's how I would answer that question. Yes?
Just like you said about Islamic feminism and Islamic liberalism,
Yeah.
there's one more term which is more coined in Pakistan than any other ism,
Yeah.
which is Islamic democracy.
Okay.
And Islamic feminism is coined by some youth, okay? That's justified, it's not from Islam. But Islamic democracy is an idea which is propagated by Islamists.
Yeah.
So what do you have to say about that?
See, democracy is a little bit more complicated. Okay. But the reason why is because democracy is, when we talk about democracy, traditionally it's been divided into 2. Okay. You have direct democracy and you have representative democracy. So direct democracy is what the Athenians done back in Athens. And this is, by the way, democracy is older than Christianity and Islam. Okay. It's, when we say Islam, obviously we're talking about the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. We're talking about democracy is over 2,500 years. So it's an ancient ideology, right? And what they did was that they used to basically ask everyone, referendum style, what should be done in a certain place for each issue. This is called direct democracy. We're not talking about that now, we're talking about representative democracy. So the reason why it's a little bit different is because representative democracy, although it's not seen as an object of morality, okay, some scholars have allowed it to be used instrumentally in order for Muslims to get into power or for good to be done. And that is the majority view, by the way. Like the majority view throughout the world of scholars from all schools of thought is that democracy can be used instrumentally. Now, there's a difference between using something instrumentally as an instrument and believing it's true fully. Because democracy, unlike most of these other ideologies, has a propensity to self-destruct. And I always give these kinds of thought experiments to people who, in the West. I say for example, they say, in Pakistan they don't have democracy, for example. Okay, it's true. Okay, maybe they don't. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, whatever, yeah? In Egypt, they don't have democracy. Okay, in this place, fine. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's not my business, yeah? But what I will say is this. Let's say we had direct democracy, the purest and cleanest type of democracy you can get, yeah? And we've done a referendum and we asked the people, look, what should be the punishment for for theft? And 99% of the population, or 95, 90%, a strong majority said what? Cutting the hand off, amputation. Now, according to this reasoning, surely cutting the hand has a democratic mandate, for example. Now it has a democratic mandate. So now you put the person in a very tricky position, because if they are liberal critics of Islam, they have to allow Islam to exist through democracy. The problem with the West is that they say have democracy, then when the East uses it, they're not happy with the results of it. So you can make your decision. Okay, we've made our decision. We want this person or that person. No. Which, you see, the West is in control of the democratic process here in Pakistan and in other places. And so really you don't even have it. So that's number one. Number two is this. Number two is, say you had democracy, right? And we do once again a referendum. We make a decision to remove democracy through democracy. Like Hitler did it, sorry to say. And I'm not saying that he did that through the consent of the people, because there was he did it without the consent of the people. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, we have a vote, do we want democracy? And everyone says no. Then it's an ironic and paradoxical situation, because then you can use democracy to remove democracy. Do you see what I mean? So if someone says, why are you removing democracy? It's because these people didn't want it. And that was their democratic prerogative. So democracy, by the way, is not always in line with liberalism and or feminism. Definitely not liberalism. It's conceivable to have democratic totalitarianism. It's conceivable to have democratic authoritarianism. Because democracy is just getting the will of the people and getting the mandate. You don't have to have liberalism and democracy coexist. So to answer your question, because in the beginning you asked about Islamic democracy. It's not Islamic. I don't like those. I've seen Al-Qaradawi's, what he had to say about this. I read it. And other scholars, that democracy is part of Islam because it's like shura. وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. In chapter 42 of the Quran, it says that consultation. This is not the same as that. This is not. If we're being academically honest, shura is a consultation process which is done traditionally by أهل الحل والعقد, by a certain group of people. And there's books that are written about it. For example, Al-Ghiyathi by Al-Juwayni and Ahkam al-Sultaniyya of Mawaridi and others. Nothing to do with what you're talking about. However, the question is not whether democracy is part of Islam, because most scholars will tell you it's not, except for Qaradawi and a few others. Yeah. The question is, can we use democracy for Islam? That's the question. And I'm of the opinion that you can use effectively any instrument for Islam. And the evidence for that we mentioned at the beginning is Yusuf alayhi salam. Yusuf alayhi salam, what did he do? He went into a government which is a non-Muslim government. If you think about it. Because the king of Egypt at that time, he did not believe in Islam. How do we know that? Because Surah Yusuf itself said, مَا كَانَ يَأْخُذُهُ فِي دِينِ الْمَلِكِ. That he was not going to, the deen of the Malik was different. The religion of the Malik was different to the religion of Islam. Ibn Taymiyyah, who's scriptural literalist in this, he says, this shows you that in order to make a bad situation better, you can enter something like politics, enter this, that, the other. So what I'm saying to you is, sometimes you can enter these fields using democracy, but there's a difference between saying we're going to use democracy and asserting that it's part of Islam. We're not saying it's part of Islam. We're saying the majority of scholars of Islam say you can use it, because if you don't use it, the alternative is you're going to have some other guy, who doesn't have the Islamic values and who's going to lead us astray. So that is what the majority of scholars in the world today say.